Government Adhyakshan Professor M.D.S. Narayanan, Larry Shenicha, Chairman of the Asian Foundation and Trust, Professor Sadiq Walasnan, Shri Rais Ahmed, Janab C.P. Punja Muhammad Sahib, Vedil Sasirkin Ella Bahumanyire, Shri Ahmedine Arnya, Ishtapata Bahumanikinavire, Sahodri Saudamare, Ella Kumende, Vinidamaya Namaskar. Professor Narayanan in the Shri Hasnainam Avashyappettadu njan Englishil rendu vaakku parayunnaanu. So വിരോധമില്ലെങ്കിൽ എൻ്റെ theme ഞാൻ ഒരു formal lecture ആയി prepare ചെയ്തത് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലാണ്. ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ സംസാരിച്ചോളൂ. So thank you very much, Hasnain sir, for inviting me to speak today on the occasion of the inaugural Eid Ahmed Memorial Lecture. And I'm really honored to be able to do so while simultaneously paying my respect to my late colleague Edapakat Ahmed, as we all called him, Ahmed Sahib. I would like to believe that the topic I'm speaking on today would have held a place of special importance to Ahmed Sahib, a leader for who the better part of his political career was a champion of the vulnerable and the downtrodden, who remained till the very end a staunch opponent of the divisive and bigoted nationalistic fervour that holds our country hostage in these contentious times. Since I'm speaking to busy people whose patience is naturally limited and who would want to know what they might gain from listening to me, I thought I should make it worthwhile for you by giving you at least a few takeaway points about today's habit of rewriting history and redefining nationalism, and the challenge this all faces in these contentious times. When Woodrow Wilson, the towering leader of his time, announced his famous 14 points to end the First World War, the then French President Georges Clemenceau remarked, 14 points? Even God had only 10. So let me not try and compete with Moses. I will just advance 4 simple propositions about Indian nationalism, the attempts to redefine this nationalism and the attacks on it, and what we as Indians who are conscious of the strength of our pluralistic heritage must do to resist these trends. First, Indian nationalism, unlike anywhere else in the world, is the nationalism of an idea, what we like to call the idea of India, because it is not based on any of the conventional indices of national identity. If you look at what people define their nationalism by in other countries, you will find a few common ingredients. For example, people speak of being unified by a language. So all the Germans speak German, all the Dutch speak Dutch, and so on. But we, of course, have 23 official languages and as many as 35 languages spoken by more than 1 million people each. Others speak in terms of ethnicity. The Dane is a recognizable type. The Englishman is a particular ethnicity. But again, India, what is an Indian accommodates a diversity of ethnic types, in which many Indians, Punjabis and Bengalis in particular, have more ethnically in common with so-called foreigners than with their compatriots. So an Indian Punjabi is ethnically closer to a Pakistani Punjabi, just as an Indian Bengali is ethnically identical to a Bangladeshi Bengali. And therefore, in ethnic terms, they're closer to these foreigners than to a Poonawala or a Bangalorean. So ethnicity is not the explanation for Indian nationalism. Some speak in terms of religion. A lot of the Western countries speak of their nationalism being anchored in a Judeo-Christian heritage. Well, in India, of course, we have a secular pluralist state that is home to every religion known to mankind, with the possible exception of Shintoism. Since every religion has a home in India, one religion does not explain our nationalism. Some people speak in terms of geography. Many of the island countries are a continent-sized country like Australia. But for us, geography doesn't give us our nationhood, since the natural geography of the subcontinent, framed by the mountains and the sea, the Bharatvarsha and the Rig Veda, that was hacked by the partition of 1947. So we don't have a geography-based nationalism either. And finally, we can't even speak of a nationalism based on a defined territory, since by law, anyone with one grandparent born in pre-partition India, outside the territorial boundaries of today's state, except of course Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, are eligible for citizenship. Indian nationalism, therefore, is not based on any of these classic things, not language, not religion, not ethnicity, not geography, not territory. It is therefore based on an idea. It's an idea which in many ways is based on, yes, a shared geography undoubtedly, but more important, a common history, and an idea that is anchored in something larger than any one of these five elements. Our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, articulated this idea better than anyone, thank you, when he spoke of India as a land that is always celebrated and welcomed. Pluralism, an idea really vindicated by history itself. The phrase, the idea of India, is Rabindranath Tagore's, but the idea is arguably as old as antiquity itself. Nehru described our country as an ancient palimpsest. I don't know if many of you know what a palimpsest is. Imagine if I come and write on a wall. I mean, he comes and writes on top of what I have written, without erasing what I have written. And then Professor Narayan comes and writes on top of what Professor Hasnain has written. And Mr. Kunya Mohammed comes and writes on top of that. And Rais comes and writes on top of that still. The result is a palimpsest, where every one of our inputs is there, but nothing has been erased. That is Nehru's idea of India, as an ancient palimpsest. And he said that successive rulers and successive subjects have inscribed their visions without, of course, erasing what had been asserted previously. And we not only coexist in that way, but we thrive in our diversity, which is our strength. He was followed by a generation of secular nationalists who echoed this tradition, making unity in diversity the most hallowed of independent India's self-defining slogans, even if the phrase seems contradictory to external observers. But India has always been more than the sum of its contradictions. Nehruji, again, if I may quote him, said it's a country held together by strong but invisible threads. And I'm quoting him now, a myth and an idea, a dream and a vision, and yet very real and present and pervasive, unquote. However, the idea of India as a modern nation based on a certain conception of a constitution, human rights, citizenship, vigorously backed by a due process of law and equality before the law, is a relatively recent and strikingly modern idea. Earlier conceptions of India drew their inspiration from mythology and theology, but modern India, despite the mystical influence of Tagore or the spiritual and moral influences of Mahatma Gandhi, is a robustly secular and legal construct based upon the vision and intellect of our founding fathers, notably in alphabetical order, Ambedkar, Nehru and Patel. The preamble of the Constitution itself is the most eloquent enumeration of this vision. In its description of the defining traits of the Indian Republic, in its conception of justice, of liberty, of equality and fraternity, it firmly proclaims that the law will be the bedrock of the idea of India. How did India preserve and project and protect a viable idea of itself in the course of the last 70 years, while it grew from 370 million people to 1.3 billion, reorganized its state structures, and sought to defend itself from internal and external dangers, all the while remaining democratic? Certainly this accomplishment is extraordinary and worthy of celebration. Amid India's myriad problems, it is democracy that has given Indians of every imaginable caste, creed, color, culture, cause, cuisine, custom and costume the chance to break free of their old problems and to rally around a consensus. And that consensus is on the very simple democratic principle that you don't need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. Now, a distinctive feature of the Nehruvian legacy was its visionary rejection of India's assorted bigotries and particularisms. All four generations of Nehrus in public life remained secular in outlook and conduct. Their appeal transcended caste, region, language, and religion, something virtually impossible to say of most other leading Indian politicians. Yet, whether through elections or quotas or political mobilization, contemporary India continues to assert the power of old identities, habits, faiths, and prejudices, transcending them as a major challenge for the Indian polity in the 21st century. One does question, what makes India a nation? In a country notorious for identity politics, especially at election time, we may well ask, what is an Indian's identity? You know, when the Italian nation was created in the second half of the 19th century, out of a mosaic of principalities and statelets, one Italian nationalist, Massimo Taparelli-Lasello, wrote, quote, "We have created Italy, now all we need to do is to create Italians," unquote. It's striking that half a century later, or at that time or later, that is 1947 onwards, no Indian nationalists succumbed to the temptation to express a similar thought. The prime exponent of modern Indian nationalism, Nehruji, would never have spoken of creating Indians because he believed that what India and Indians had always existed for millennia before he articulated their political aspirations in the 20th century. Yet, nonetheless, the India that was born in 1947 was in a very real sense a new creation. A state that made fellow citizens of the Ladakhi and the Laccadivian for the first time, that divided Punjabi from Punjabi for the first time, that asked the Keralite peasant to pay allegiance to Kashmiri Pandit ruling in Delhi, also for the first time. It is the idea, therefore, this idea of India, of an ever of a land, emerging from an ancient civilization, united by a shared history, sustained by pluralist democracy. India's democracy imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens. The whole point of Indian pluralism is that you can be many things in one thing. You can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at once. The Indian idea is the opposite of what Freudians call the narcissism of minor differences. When I was handling the Yugoslav civil war for the United Nations, there was a lot of theory saying that here are the same people descended from the same Slavic tribes who inhabited the Balkans in the 7th century onwards, separated by politics and history. And these people are busy murdering each other, assaulting each other, raping each other, and so on. This is what reminded people of the Freudian concept of the narcissism of minor differences. Whereas in India, we celebrate the commonality of major differences. So the idea of India is of one land embracing many. Several years ago in the US, I addressed the Wharton Business School's India Forum on realizing the Indian dream. And I told them that the Indian dream must be a dream that can be dreamt in Gujarati or in Tamil, dreamt by a Muslim or a Parsi or a Khasi, dreamt by a Brahmin or a Bodo, dreamt on a charpai or a luxury king bed. Any narrower definition of Indianness would not just be pernicious, it would be an insult to Indian nationhood. An India that denies itself to some Indians would no longer be the India that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free. Today, this idea of India, as symbolized by its commitment to inclusivity, pluralism, and secularism, stands fundamentally contested by a dispensation that has sought to redefine nationalism in more sectarian terms. Our rulers have a lack of vision and absence of depth that prevents them from seeing the larger principle that India has always defined for the world then and today. But this challenge to a more tolerant version of nationalism is not a problem endemic to India alone. It reflects and must also be situated within the context of the current global wave of populism and the rise of illiberal right-wing politics that is taking place currently, which brings me to my second point. We're living in the age of a worldwide backlash against globalization, against cosmopolitanism, against multiculturalism. An ugly byproduct of this is the rise of mandatory patriotism and, at its heart, conformity as the new badge of allegiance. The global rise of officially mandated nationalism is widespread. The century began with globalization seeming unstoppable, national boundaries appearing ever more permeable, states surrendering more and more of their sovereignty to supranational organizations like the European Union, to regional and global trade banks, refereed by the World Trade Organization, to international legal institutions like the International Criminal Court. But few could have foreseen such an abrupt reversal of this trend halfway through the second decade of the 20th century. The global backlash against the forces that have defined the first decade and a half of our century has taken on a nativist hue everywhere. In Europe and America, this has involved racist hostility to immigrants and minorities, whether ethnically or religiously defined. Since such negative messaging requires a positive counterpart, nationalism has filled the breach, as a majoritarian narrative has sought to subsume each country's diverse political tendencies into an artificial mandated unity, masquerading as patriotism. A fortnight short of a year ago, we were all taken aback when America decided to elect Donald Trump to the highest office in the free world, attached to the proposition that Trump would make America great again, which in many ways was code for make America white again. In less than a year, in his first year in office, Trump and his army of Trumpists have declared war on anybody who defiles the American flag, a symbol of American nationalism, with Trump himself suggesting extensive punitive damages for such an offense, in a land where the flag can legally form a garment to cover just about any part of your body. You can wear a bikini made of the American flag and it's acceptable. So it's quite interesting that Trump is trying this. More recently, America's world-famous football league, NFL league, has been rocked by the Take the Knee movement, first started by an African-American football player, Colin Kaepernick, who decided to kneel during the national anthem during a game in protest of what he felt was a systematic and continued discrimination against the African-American community in the US. Other colleagues of his have been quick to follow in solidarity. Colin Kaepernick himself has lost his job. They're fired him from his team. And Trump and his supporters have lambasted it and categorized it as an insult to the nation. Well, perhaps it is an insult, and this is an issue for debate. I know that a Muslim friend of mine wrote to me saying, what do you think, shall I do the same thing in India? And I said, don't do it, because you will play into the hands of the BJP and the ultra-nationalists if you do it. In America, however, where the permissibility of these things is different, it's become a big issue. Globalization had promised a world of dissolving differences and ever-expanding freedoms that would embrace and include everyone. Instead, today's reactive nationalism heightens differences, emphasizes singular virtues associated with a politically defined people, and seeks to instill loyalty and commitment to the state and its emblems. The level of the national flag, the national anthem, the lapel pin like the one I'm wearing, or reverence for the military sacrifices, I have no problem with this. But when these symbols are used to promote a sense of duty rather than affection for the idea of the nation, and compliance with the prevailing governmental narrative rather than freedom for each citizen to interpret national unity and loyalty in her own way, then I do have a problem. Because then respect for the anthem and the flag becomes a code for obedience to the state and the ruling party. To put it plainly, conformity has now become the new badge of allegiance. In a widely discussed recent paper, the Harvard scholar Yashar Monk and his colleague Roberto Four argue that the health of liberal democracies around the world is falling, and that the former consolidated democracies around the globe confront imminent degeneration. They've done a lot of data research from the World Value Surveys from 1995 to 2015, and they show there's been a considerable dilution of support for democracy and growing impatience with the democratic process, especially amongst the so-called millennial generations, those born after the 1980s. And that we can no longer assume that once a country upholds democratic traditions for a steady part for the period of time, fosters strong civil society traditions, and attains a degree of wealth, that the future of democracy is secure in its hands. That is, according to these scholars, a fallacy, and we must always guard against complacency. I think many of you have seen the poll that was discussed in the Indian papers last week, where a majority of those surveyed said that they would prefer to have a dictatorship in this country than democracy. That is the situation that we are now facing in some people's mentality. The wave of rising right-wing populism that is engulfing Europe is illustrative of this trend. Support for anti-system populist parties, such as the National Front in France, Syriza in Greece, the Five Star Movement in Italy, are only the most absolute examples. This is occurring when there is a risk of a real power vacuum in Europe. While Netherlands and France have seemingly bucked the trend, recent successes of Austria's far-right groups, Germany's AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, suggest that the trend is strong and it's spreading. These are troubling and potentially dangerous developments. The idea of the nation as an inclusive community of all citizens, one that allows each individual to shelter under the constitutional carapace and to pursue his or her own ideas of happiness, free from the stipulations of others, is being tossed aside in the name of a higher patriotic duty to an officially sanctioned version of nationalism. This is reminiscent of the same slippery slope down which Italy and Germany slid into fascism and Nazism in the 1920s and 30s. Such fears may seem exaggerated in today's democracies, with modern means of communication and thriving free media and social media, but complacency is no longer an option. On India's part, it's a country that has traditionally gained from abandoning its post-colonial autocracy and from lowering protectionist barriers that restricted foreign investment and reduced trade. Along with this, greater openness to the world has come a broader receptivity to prevailing international norms in everything from business culture to permissive sexual behavior and to subsuming patriotism within a broader liberal internationalism. That is now grinding to a halt pretty much everywhere. This brings me to my third point, which is that Indian nationalism is today being dictated by those who wish to impose a narrow, sectarian, straitjacketed version of nationalism that ignores India's diversity and rich pluralistic traditions. On November 26, 1949, on the occasion of the conclusion of the long process of constitution making, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly, had a prescient warning to offer to the nation. And I'd like to quote him. He said, "However good a constitution may be, it is sure to turn out bad because those who are called to work it happen to be a bad lot. However bad a constitution may be, it may turn out to be good if those who are called to work it happen to be a good lot. The working of a constitution does not depend only upon the nature of the constitution." Unquote. It's a sobering reminder that the Constitution, and indeed the idea of India that we celebrate today, can be distorted and misused by wrong-minded people in power. In today's times, the BJP, political heirs of a movement that actually stood aside from the freedom struggle and sometimes actively collaborated with colonial rulers, stands anxious to claim a certain amount of tradition and to cloak the divisive beast it really is in a shroud of patriotic fervour. Heroes of independence are being appropriated, sometimes wantonly, to fit this agenda. But these attempts by the BJP are an effort at rebranding their own controversial version of nationalism and the non-existent record in fighting for independence, seeking to acquire a backdoor, retrospective legitimacy. They seek to hijack history, shaped by the sacrifices of others, while brushing under the carpet the actions and philosophies of their own founders, whose idea of India was diametrically opposite to that espoused and celebrated by Congress's visionaries and the nationalist movement. In other words, the BJP and its leaders have no alternative apparently than to dip into the vast pantheon of Congress heroes to legitimize themselves and find a place for themselves in the freedom struggle of this nation, and to create a fresh narrative that obscures the truth of their political provenance with a blatant and fallacious photoshopping of history. The Prime Minister remains anxious to play down his controversial leadership in Gujarat. Himself is on a mission to acquire glory through association with Sardar Patel. Instead of a man under whose watch at least 1,000 people lost their lives, he seeks to cast himself in the image of a tough, decisive man of action, an evident effort to transform himself into someone more substantial in the eyes of history. Is it any wonder that his party is also engaged in similar efforts, when its tallest leader must borrow idols from elsewhere and seek to refashion his own past? We can be sure that the evocation of the freedom struggle until August 2022, when India turns 75, will be relentless, and it's going to be built on the sacrifices of congressmen selectively appropriated by the Prime Minister and the BJP to serve their narrative. It is somewhat tragic that a ruling government and its leader have such a staggering lack of confidence, but such is the void the BJP has in its narrative, that it has no alternative than seeking to borrow glory and greatness where it has none of its own. For instance, we would hear endless statements about how Patel forged national unity, how he stood up for the nation's Hindus during partition, and how he was firm on Kashmir, while Prime Minister Nehru was allegedly pussyfooting in the UN, sacrificing national interests for international grandstanding. Mr. Modi has publicly stated that India would have been better off had Sardar Patel instead of Nehru been at the helm during independence. This overlooks the fact that Sardar Patel actually endorsed Nehru and stated to him directly, and I quote, "In our combination lies our greatest strength." But of course it's understandable that the spirit of cooperation is beyond the grasp of the BJP. Division is the cornerstone of their ideology, and expecting this party to comprehend the idea of unity would be to unsettle its very core. What is striking in all this is how different, in fact, were the behaviors of Patel and Modi when confronted with a very similar set of circumstances at different times. The violence of 2002 in Gujarat and the violence of 1947 in northern India. The violence that accompanied partition did not only show Patel protecting Hindus, as the BJP narrative would imply. In fact, he saw it as a serious breakdown of law and order, just like Gujarat in 2002. In both cases, there was rioting and violence against Muslims. However, in Delhi in 1947, Patel moved immediately to ensure the protection of Muslims. He secured 10,000 vulnerable people from different parts of the city in the security of the Red Fort. And because Patel was afraid that local security forces might be infected by the communal virus because of many people had lost families and so on in the partition, he moved troops from Madras and Pune into Delhi to ensure their protection against violence. He also made it a point to send a signal to the Muslim community by attending prayers at the Nizamuddin Dargah to send a clear message that the Muslims and their faith belonged unquestionably on the soil of India. He went to Amritsar where there were attacks on Muslims fleeing to Pakistan, and he pleaded with Hindus and Sikhs to stop victimizing refugees. In each of these cases, Patel succeeded, and there are tens of thousands of people and their descendants who are alive today because of his intervention. The contrast with what happened in 2002 is painful, and whether or not one can ascribe blame to Mr. Modi for the pogrom, it is certainly true that he can claim no credit for acting in a way that is comparable to Sardar Patel, the man in whose footsteps he claims to follow. In Gujarat, there was not only no direct and immediate action by Mr. Modi as chief executive of the state to protect Muslims, but he also held back from public condemnation of the attacks, leave alone emphasizing, at least through symbolic actions, such as visiting a masjid or a Muslim neighborhood to convey reassurance to displaced and violently brutalized communities. He would not have, because the fact is that our government today has a view of Indianness and of Indian culture that is extraordinarily petty. A party whose leading members disowned the Taj Mahal and refused to celebrate the life of a hero who defeated the British in battle, in both cases on purely religious grounds, now presumes to lead India. Whereas Nehruji saw India as a product of many cultural, religious, folk traditions, a land to which people from a variety of backgrounds has contributed, the BJP has reduced the idea of India to Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. If you don't speak Hindi, you are second class. If you are not Hindu, you are here on their sufferance, on their mercy. That is their idea of Hindustan, and their vision of India has no room for the millions of Indians who do not conform to this narrow stereotype. The capacious Indian culture that E. Ahmed embodied in his life and beliefs is not a culture that they are proud of. Instead, they've given us mob violence and communal lynchings in the name of cow protection, enforcers of the ruling party who tell us what we can and cannot eat, how we should and should not dress, and whom we are permitted to love. The Karma, Love Jihad, and anti-Romeo squads are the BJP's contribution to our national vocabulary. The question we must address is how we can deal responsibly with these efforts of the BJP in a way that affirms our commitment to Indian nationalism and to the freedom struggle, without surrendering to blatant attempts to identify the Indian nation not only with the government of the day, but specifically with a BJP government that has no real historical credentials when a mirror of facts is held up to its face. We must remind our nation that the leaderships to agencies such as the RSS traced their genealogy, kept aloof from the freedom struggle because they were concerned only with what independence would mean for the Hindus. They had no conception of India as anything greater than the sum of all its Hindus, in other words, a sort of Hindu Pakistan. We must bring the spotlight on their own leaders, like Golwalkar, the second Sachin of the RSS, who kept his cadre outside the Quit India movement that the BJP is now keen on embracing. This is hardly surprising, since Golwalkar was also a man who praised the Nazi campaign against the Jews, seeing lessons in it for Hindustan. Ancestors of the BJP, right up to Savarkar, chose to bless the British war effort in another continent far away rather than support fellow compatriots in prison during that time. So much so that the British themselves acknowledged that the RSS had, and I quote, scrupulously kept itself within the law and refrained from taking part in the disturbances that broke out in August 1942, unquote. For all its talk about nationalism, the BJP has only darkness and embarrassment to look back upon if facts, rather than contemporary propaganda, were to be considered. No wonder the BJP is so enthralled by some of the instruments exercised by the colonial state against Indians who stood up to injustice. After 70 years, for instance, the very same sedition law that locked up Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru and indeed even Sardar Patel in jail is being used to suppress dissent, terrorize those who refuse to toe the line drawn by the BJP, and challenge their right to issue certificates of patriotism to their citizens. The entire history of the BJP can be summed up in one word: hypocrisy. We have seen this in multiple issues of JNU, Rohit Vemula, the recent Amnesty International in India case, the attempt to create a dichotomy of national and anti-national identity in India on the back of a narrow definition of nationalism, even while borrowing names from the past that would be horrified by the way in which their legacies are being distorted and defiled today. This is proof of this hypocrisy of the ruling government and its leaders. How did they expect to get away with it when it was Sardar Patel himself who banned the RSS after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi? Is another question we must hold up to them. Patel boldly wrote to Golwalkar rejecting the atmosphere created by the RSS, alluding to the distribution of sweets after Gandhi's assassination, and making it clear that it was inevitable that the government would take action against the RSS. Today, the RSS's political wing, the BJP, wishes to equate nationalism with majoritarianism, despite the fact that this will have very few takers in India. The very response to their efforts has made this clear. Attempts to divide Indian society into us and them, with us being all those who stand with the government and its ideology, have resulted in strong battles in the public domain at numerous levels, from the returning of awards by towering intellectuals to student agitations across the country. The BJP has always been good at fostering chaos, but today they do so while simultaneously making an attempt to pull wool over the eyes of the nation. My fourth and final point: this is a battle for India's soul. All of us who believe in the liberal values embodied in our constitution must strive to ensure that the ultimate winner must be the idea of India. Indians must remain faithful to our founding values. The Indian idea that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, all that I said, and rally around the consensus of the ground rules of how you read that is what is being destroyed today. My idea of India celebrates diversity. If America is a melting pot, as I've long argued, then to me, India is a thali, a selection of sumptuous dishes in different bowls. Each tastes different, because each is a separate bowl, it doesn't necessarily flow into the next. But all these bowls belong together on the same plate, the same thali, and they complement each other in making the meal a satisfying repast. Why should the nation ever accept the BJP's brand of nationalism? As a nation, we're committed to the idea that India is a nation based on civic rather than ethnic identity. It is heir to an ageless civilization that has every kind of variety imaginable. A land where 4 major world religions were founded, and 4 others have a home that came from elsewhere. A country of 85 recognized political parties, 58 of which are in parliament. A country where joked we have 300 different ways of cooking the potato. Trying to straitjacket such diversity, which exists on practically every level in our country, into majoritarian nationalism by rewriting history is a pitiable effort, exposing the BJP's own insecurities. The BJP can rewrite textbooks, and they're doing that. In Maharashtra, the Mughals are being taken out. In Rajasthan, the defeat of Maharana Pratap at the hands of Akbar's General Man Singh is being described as a victory of Rana Pratap. This is the way in which history is being rewritten. But it cannot re-engineer the soul of India. Its concept of Hindu nationalism, which goes against every thread in the great fabric of Hinduism, seeks to privilege one version of the religion, one language, one discourse, requiring everyone to conform. The irony is that many good Hindus will tell you that Swami Vivekananda said in his famous discourse in Chicago in 1892 that the strength of Hinduism is that it goes beyond tolerance to acceptance. It accepts that all kinds of religion, all ways of reaching out to God are equally true. That is the broad Hinduism that most Hindus have grown up with, not the Hinduism or the Hindutva of the BJP. And they are requiring everyone to conform, stifling healthy debate and dissent, all while undermining the ethos of our constitution and our democracy, where to be Indian is to have multiple identities, not one decided by men in khaki shorts. I think now they're seeking a new reincarnation in long brown pants, but anyway, for 70 years it was khaki shorts. Their narrow worldviews and minds have no place in the 21st century. Those of us who fight to defend India against such efforts by the RSS and the BJP must put together a more united front, however. For instance, during the Bharat Mata Ki Jai controversy, we in the opposition did not sufficiently join forces to oppose the public bullying that the BJP functioned as. The BJP does not recognize that in our democracy, we not only have a right to free speech and to voice what we believe in, but we also possess the right not to speak. If indeed some of my Muslim friends don't want to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai because they feel that in their understanding of their religion, they cannot make the nation into a goddess, that should be their right. It is their right under the Constitution. Some Muslims will say it, some may say, no, that's not the way I understand it. That's fine. That's what democracy and freedom is all about. Nobody can be forced to speak against their will simply because a mob insists that they speak. Our Constitution allows us the freedom of speech and the freedom to remain silent. A distinction and a nuance that the BJP, with its tendency to flout constitutional principles, or maybe its inability to simply comprehend bigger ideas, breaches in its quest to subject citizens of this free nation to an acid test of their narrow design and determination alone. This has happened time and again, and we fail to collectively challenge fallacious claims and controversial actions effectively, staying on in our separate opposition benches. It is time that we all unite to stand up to the RSS and the BJP and call out the unhistorical and morally reprehensible agenda they pass off as nationalism and nation building. I think the Muslim League of Ahmed understood this and worked closely with us. He understood that we must gather together to not only preserve our idea of India, but also to effectively remind the Indian people that what the BJP peddles is a poison, that could damage irreparably our future if it is allowed to get out of hand. We must resist attempts to equate the Indian nation with the ruling government, and such concerted efforts to shift patriotism from the Tiranga to the person of the Prime Minister and his very many speeches, all full of rhetorical flourishes, but lacking in the substance that makes great leadership. If the BJP has any sense of vision or of a goal beyond creating a Hindu Pakistan, then they must realize they must carry out the dreams of all Indians as a responsible government. As Patel, Nehru, Ambedkar, Azad so clearly understood, the mandate of any government is not to turn citizens of the nation into foot soldiers against enemies of its own invention. Governments must uphold our constitution and the future of all Indians, not succumb to the games of who is and who isn't a nationalist. If Mr. Modi and his party continue down this very slippery slope, no matter how many leaders from history they borrow or indeed hijack, they will be exposed and history will see them for what they really are, men of straw with limited vision, unable to comprehend the great, diverse, united society they are meant to govern, not to divide and to break up. Today, as we recall the proud legacy of E. Ahmed, we must also affirm the positive vision of the India he stood for, an India that includes all in the grand narrative of hope that has been the story of our country at least till 2014, and that we must ensure remains our story in the future. We must uphold our great founding values of the 20th century if we are to succeed in the 21st. Thank you very much, Vijay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your eloquent and highly informative